Okay, hello and welcome to another episode of the Hoppean Book Club. Today we are going over the cultural thought of Ludwig von Mises, and I am Colton.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Emo.
And I'm Bert.
Yeah, we have a new guest tonight, which is Bert.
Yep, you'll remember him from yesterday's live stream on my channel. So, yeah, he's making another appearance. He also has an article on the Hoppean.org, so go ahead and check that out.
Yep. His Twitter is also on the top right-hand corner with everyone else's, so...
Awesome, thanks guys.
Yep.
So, does anyone want to explain the podcast, or should I again?
You go ahead.
Okay. So this podcast is to go over various libertarian works. It's for people to read and follow along. We want a discussion with the chat, so go ahead and leave comments in the chat or in the book club after the chat. We'll try our best to keep on top of that. We want suggestions of books with the theme being Austrian economics and libertarianism. This week we're actually covering a suggestion from Matt. So this is just showing that we will cover suggestions typically. Other schools of libertarianism could be covered in the future, but we're trying to get the main books of the Austrian school done. And I think the timing of this article is really, really important because we're starting our focus on Mises, and this article apes a lot of the themes from Socialism, a book by Mises, and Socialism is what we're going to be doing next week, so that is good. Good introduction.
This article is pretty short. It was like 30 pages long, I believe, but there was like references and stuff, so maybe 25 pages or something. It's basically an analysis of Mises' works and I guess a summary of his views specifically on social policy and culture.
Which actually goes into in Socialism and economic and sociological analysis. And that it's really interesting to see him essentially make arguments that the theological basis, so he's talking about culture, and so a lot of theologians also talk about this, obviously. But he's making arguments that kind of mainstream theologians miss on, and then, but mainstream theologians would also come in and kind of complete what Mises is analyzing here.
Yeah, this is a good article because it kind of like completely debunks the whole like economic liberals have to be social liberals as well, which is almost like it's not like almost unanimous, but it's very, very widely spread among the libertarian right.
Well, it's not just that, but if you look at Mises says this, but it's also Rothbard and Hoppe. It's like the people who actually founded libertarianism were all cultural reactionaries, essentially. At least they would be today.
Yeah, and it's like the libertarian movement, so to speak, they just ignore that. And you have this trend where Hoppe is almost entirely rejected by the libertarian movement. Rothbard is the foundation for like most of it, and they still like actively reject his writings on culture and on social issues. They call I've even seen people call him a crypto-fascist, which is
Yeah, and
pretty funny.
I've also seen people say that Rothbard went senile in his 50s and 60s because he didn't he started saying things that didn't agree with them culturally. And it's like he was part of the old right in the 1930s. It's not like his right-wing cultural views just came up in the 80s and 90s. He just started talking about them more because he stopped trying to ally himself with the left.
Yeah, there's only so much you can write about economics as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, I mean there's still things to go over in economics, but
No, I
you'll
mean,
probably
like
get,
for him, he probably also just wanted to talk about different things.
yeah, that's what I've got to say is when you've already written Man, Economy, and State, the Anatomy of the State, Hell and Markets, everything else he's written, it it becomes kind of boring to basically rehash everything because if you're going to be talking about monetary theory, because you also talked about monetary theory in different books, you're just going to be basically rehashing arguments because when you understand the basics of Austrian economics, things just keep the fallacies in mainstream economics just keep on rearing their ugly heads over and over and over.
Yeah, pretty much.
So it can get fairly boring to actually just like talk about economics just because it's you know. Anyways,
Yeah, so
so
this article is divided in sections which are appropriately titled, so it's easy to keep track of what we're talking about. Um, and yeah, you gonna get started?
yeah, so the abstract of this starts out just with the general overview. So, in matters of public policy, Mises was a firm supporter of the free market, hard money, and the rule of law. He was considered a member of the conservative movements in the U.S., but this was qualified by what Rothbard called Mises being a laissez-faire radical. This included the right for national self-determination and secession as well as opposition to war and militarism. This radicalism did not imply any sympathy for moral libertinism or cultural relativism. What Mises believed are the hallmarks of the modern American traditionalist conservatism. Mises was not only an opponent of the political agenda of the left, but its cultural agenda as well. No opponent of socialism can overlook either part. And this is actually something I really think criticizes two movements. It doesn't just criticize the libertarians that want to ally themselves with the left and say things like we must not just be passively not racist, we must be actively anti-racist. It also goes to a bunch of clergy, especially Roman Catholic clergy, that tries to just look at socialism and communism from a purely cultural aspect and not really get involved in economics, and because they basically agree with the economics of socialism or communism, if you really listen to what they're saying. So I think it kind of is an important critique of the two different sides of the coin, of one being economic freedom but social libertinism, and then the other one being economic socialism but cultural conservatism.
Yep. So yeah, it's just going on about how there's this difference, I guess, that's this emphasis on the separation between economic doctrine and social cultural doctrine, while most of the time they are tied together to a great extent. and the left is all about destroying capitalism, and a lot of these traditional institutions, at least Western traditional institutions, and culture and traditions are tied to capitalism, and thus, in order to destroy it, they also target these things actively. So there's not really an intellectually fair way to just disconnect the two things entirely.
Right, and Jeffrey Tucker shows that Mises sees this as a destruction of the natural order, either when you're attacking free market economics or when you're attacking things like the family and how traditionalism has viewed sexuality.
Yeah.
So, someone in the comment section, I can't pronounce the name, said greatly increased opportunities for economically motivated migration would thus result, and the world would be one of small classically liberal governments economically integrated through free trade and an international commodity money such as gold. Hunter and Hopper. I'm not sure what why you posted that quote, but yeah, I don't see the problem with it at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's just talking about how, at least I think he's referring to how without the leftist dogmas and anti-capitalism, the natural order would be classically liberal, but also traditionalist and decentralized, which is what we were just explaining. I think that's what it's referring to. I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah, a world of small Liechtensteins.
Yep. Speaking of which, not to go on a tangent, but just to, I've already started working on the next part of the series of articles that I'm working on, and it's gonna be about this part is gonna be about trade and immigration, which are very important subjects, and I used Liechtenstein as the primary example of the best model of trade and immigration policy, at least in the West. And I'm going to go into detail as to why. So, yeah, that's going to be interesting.
Yep. It'd be interesting to see. I'm guessing you're going to be going into the chapter from Democracy the God That Fails on immigration and free trade, right?
No, I actually quoted something from the article that Hoppe wrote, the case for free trade and restricted immigration. I'm not going to, or at least I haven't mentioned anything from the book yet, but I did draw things from that article, which I guess it's basically the same points.
Right. The article and the chapter are largely the same, although the chapter is just like an expanded article.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I did draw from that article the explanation of the relationship between trade and immigration, and why they are why they're not
not the same.
Yeah, why they're not the same.
Yeah. So let's continue. The socialists had more than political economy in mind. They wanted a revolution in social institutions, morals, arts, and manners. Manners and relations between the sexes and the races. Mises believed feminism was an assertion of equality, a revolt against nature, and therefore akin to socialism. That family and marital fidelity were essential to civilization. That it was possible to make broad generalizations and perhaps scientific statements about the races and ethnic groups. That apparent racial inequalities ought to be studied, although not used to influence state policy. That Eurocentrism was the proper outlook, and one need not be sympathetic to mass culture or the counterculture.
Yep.
I really like that last one. You don't have to be sympathetic to either culture, and that just reminds me of all of the monks and saints saying that to not be a friend to this world. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think it's important to just state the obvious that even though Mises was philosopher and economist, he had a lot of ideas, he had a lot of written works, most of which were focused on economics or, economic related topics, but, he's still like a person. He still has his own opinions about things. He still has things that he likes and things that he he liked and things that he disliked. So,
Right.
he's allowed to criticize things that were produced under the system that he defends, which is capitalism, and that's not contradictory because supporting the free market and supporting free enterprise and liberty doesn't really imply that you are in line or accepting of everything that may occur in that environment.
Right, and you would have. It's almost impossible not to, because the free market actually allows so much. I wouldn't say division, but just variation.
Yeah, definitely. If you
And
there's just so much that's produced because, specifically because of how many people are able to produce due to how accessible enterprises become. So there's just so much variety that it's impossible to like everything. And since there's so much accessibility, there's obviously going to be a lot of things that are bad.
Yep.
But that's not really a problem as long as people are able to make them. Because if no one was able to make them, the things that are good are also not going to happen.
Yeah, and that's something he made that's the case he made in the anti-capitalist mentality.
Yep. So do you want to go on to the first section?
Yeah, so the first section is equality versus inequality. The main theme of Mises's cultural traditionalism was the fact of human inequality. He was opposed to all forms of egalitarianism. In holding this view, Mises stood apart, as he so often did, from the social science establishment of his day in their claim that at birth, human infants, regardless of their heredity, are as equal as ferrets. And this has basically not changed the orthodoxy of our times, essentially.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, as a classical liberal that Mises was, I guess it's just difficult, I guess, to separate him from people who adhere to other beliefs that came around in the Enlightenment or after the Enlightenment. And while, classical liberalism, the rule of law, etc., were things that we consider good that came from the Enlightenment, there were also a lot of bad things, a lot of bad ideas, and a lot of bad philosophies that were also widely adopted by the establishment, and egalitarianism is one of them. This idea of that every human being at birth is a blank slate, and everything that they become depends exclusively on the environment and the people they grow around, and etc., and economic factors, and absolutely none of it is influenced by nature and biology.
Right, and this can be seen even in today's politics, where people will take racial or sexual inequality and say it's part of the environment, and You can even go back further. Blacks don't have as high of test scores, and therefore they need more equal school funding.
Yeah.
And I mean, back in the '60s, you might have been able to say this, or '50s, you might have been able to say this, and you know, just be naively wrong. But with so much data now, it's impossible to say this with any degree of validity.
Yeah.
Like the empirical data is just so overwhelmingly against this, and it even kind of shows that even back in the 1960s, schools were probably overfunded.
Yeah.
But yeah, schools have been. Yeah. Anyways, so the market makes society's existence possible, as it is the only means of social cooperation that takes into account the inherent inequality of men. His first defense of the division of labor was the innate inequality of men. The market, through the law of association, allows all men to cooperate under the social division of labor, allowing all people to pursue the tasks most in keeping with their individual talents, strengths, and dispositions.
Yeah. So what he's saying here is basically that since everyone is different, there is no way to systematically force people to cooperate. The only way to for people to for different individuals to cooperate is through how they naturally fit in the social division of labor.
Yep, and that's what he goes into in kind of this next the next thing I'm going to say. It is impossible to know, apart from information gathered by the market, which task is better suited to which individual. It is futile to attempt to eradicate inequalities, and doing so will necessarily make social conditions worse.
Yep.
Mises believed in equality before the law, but rejected attempts to derive. Can you please move your cursor out of the way? But rejected attempts to derive this from the equality of all men. Equality and the rule of law are incompatible. For Mises, democracy only had one goal: peaceful secession in government, not any equality-based defense. Equality before the law is also called the rule of law, and I think that's a better description of it than equality before the law.
Probably because the term equality has become so poisoned.
Well, yeah, I think that saying equality before the law is in saying that's a good thing, kind of lends semantic credence to people like John Rawls and other egalitarians.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
I have an excerpt here that I saved for this part, so I think it's important. So he says, Mises made a sharp distinction between two kinds of equality. The first demands that law treat everyone impartially, and the second wages war on nature by demanding that all natural and social inequalities be eliminated. Mises thought that the pursuit of the second would always result in the elimination of the first. That is to say, the pursuit of absolute equality means that people will be treated unequally and unjustly through state coercion. So what he's saying is that any attempt to systematically make people more equal depends on violating the principle of equality before the law, or the rule of law, because you're going to be systematically treating people differently.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I thought we would make that point when I spoke about this. I didn't have to write it down. But yeah, no, it's. How should I put this? The USSR tried to create equality between all people, and that resulted in gulags. You have to have severe totalitarianism in order to try to bring about egalitarianism.
You literally, I mean, he says it in there, but it's not even a metaphor. You actually have to battle with nature itself in order to have like egalitarian outcomes. You're going to have people who are smarter and who are stronger and try to make everyone equal across the board. I mean, you have to enforce very rigid and unequal laws to gin up certain results.
Yeah.
Yep. So Mises stood in dramatic opposition to political and cultural egalitarianism. Section 2. Sex, Family, and Feminism. Mises's egalitarianism can be found in his writings on sexuality, the family, the love, and feminism. Though Mises did not derive his views from a deference to tradition, he reasoned that traditional rules and institutions clearly flow from the natural interaction of men and women in freedom. That marriage and sexual relations between man and woman is part of the division of labor that is informed by biological nature, biology and nature. That women are best suited to bearing children and caring for the family, and men are best suited to providing for the family.
Yep. So he's saying that the differences, the biological differences between men and women, mean that they're naturally best fit for different roles in society, and that, you know, that's not a bad thing, and it's just how nature works, and the social division of labor has to be molded around what is natural.
Yep. So, in Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analysis, written in 1922, Mises sought to refute the arguments of those who sought to overthrow the natural order of capitalism with unnatural collectivism. He attacked the agenda of the socialists he saw as both internally consistent and consistently destructive. And
Internally inconsistent.
Internally inconsistent. I guess I said that wrong.
Yep.
As Bart already mentioned, they're battling with nature, and that's why it is consistently destructive.
Yep.
And the reason why they're battling with nature is because of the internal inconsistencies. Mises condemned the view that sexual relations should be seen as a necessary evil. To Mises, sexual relations were bound up in a human inclination towards sensuality. To achieve this sensuality, however, it must be brought under the discipline that only humans, not animals, can achieve. The process of being a man is linked to his struggle for the sexual discipline and marital fidelity in monogamous family life. He calls this a psychic strength.
Well, I know Emo was ready to say something about monogamy.
Yep.
Mises said, "Don't be horny."
Go to horny jail.
Yep, he did. He said that he says that the process of becoming a man is ultimately linked to sexual discipline. So, yeah. He basically said that if you're not ready to have a monogamous relationship, you're not a man.
Yep.
I mean, this was no fat gang.
He was not only no fat gang, he was monogamous gang, which monogamy has kind of changed in modern times. Now it means only being with one woman at a time, whereas beforehand it meant being with one woman for your entire life.
Right.
Yep. Mises says no to promiscuity.
Yep.
You should
Somebody
listen to
needs
him.
to make the Doge bonk meme with Mises.
No horny.
There's like that picture of him like looking down, where it's like angled up at him, you know?
Yeah.
Where, that's such a good pose to like put text over that refers to this.
Yeah.
like pitiful, pathetic, looking down at you.
Yeah. Noctilus has something to say, but I don't quite understand what he is saying, so I'm hoping he'll clarify. So, men must overcome their instincts and learn to control their sexual energy, an essential component of a peaceful and fulfilled life. Some men never adjust and their marriages become wrecked, not by capitalism, as the socialists claim, but from a disease that germinates not from without, but from within.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it goes across to economics as well as the sexual relationship, but it's just like the ability to save. In economics is the same thing. I feel like he's referring to here is just the ability to delay gratification and have a low time preference.
Yeah, it's literally just time preference, which thankfully Hoppe really brought back into Austrian circles, it feels like, because I mean, Mises doesn't really talk about it, at least he isn't talking about it yet. Rothbard does talk about it a little bit in Men, Economy, and State, if I am remembering that correctly. But yeah, Hoppe really brought time preference, not just from not just to apply to economics, but applied it to sociology generally.
Yeah, and it completely kind of goes against the like hedonistic thing of like, oh, if it feels good, why not do it? And it's like, well, because it may not have, even in the short term, it might be beneficial. It doesn't have long term benefits, like, and this is for economics or for like in a relationship of like, yeah, I mean, I guess in the short term, it's kind of like might be tight to go sleep with a bunch of girls, but you won't ever establish like a long term, healthy, happy relationship with anyone because you're destroying your like value in the marketplace.
Yep. And this inability for some men to adjust to a sexual discipline creates a necrosis. And Mises held that not necrosis, neurosis. Mises held the neurosis caused by the struggle for fidelity was exploited by socialists and utopians to advance their political agenda. He noted that sexual disorder was apparent in socialist writings and wished they would go get therapy.
Yeah.
It's important to note here that the utopians he is talking about are the utopian socialists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this concept of sexuality and time preference and how it relates to or correlates to ideology is more obvious than ever right now. When you see all of these,
oh, absolutely.
You just look at all these people who are on the left, and the further left they are, the more
pronouns they have.
Yeah, the more pronouns they have, the more promiscuous they are. They're more prone to polyamory and to being just degenerates in general.
Yep, and we're going to talk about polyamory soon, so I'm going to hold back my comments on that. It's for when Mises actually gets to that, or when Jeffrey Tucker like this.
That's Emo's topic.
I'm so excited. I'm
No,
so
that's my
excited
topic.
to hear about polyamory again.
It's also in Marriage versus Free Love, so it's in the next section.
But yeah, it's crazy that they had this insight. I mean, I just can't put myself in the shoes of what it was like culturally, like living in the time. But I mean, look like how relevant it is now is absolutely a great point. Just with the internet and OnlyFans and all this kind of stuff, and like the hookup culture and Tinder and how quick it is to just switch and go and be disposable.
Yep.
So it's not like Mises was just talking about something that was purely academic. He was writing this in 1920 when he had the example of Weimar Germany directly to his north.
True.
Yeah.
Weimar Germany quickly devolved into a battle between the free love socialists and the femboy Nazis.
And then one day, for no reason at all.
Yeah, so the red shirts and the brown shirts freely switch sides, so it's not like between the Nazis and socialists, so it's not like either one was clear of social degeneracy.
Yeah.
And you could see so much of Weimar German literature talking about free love, talking about prostitution, and how it's sex work and it's equal work to other type of work, like we'd have today, of transsexual, and so on and so forth. And so Mises
Yeah.
basically saw this because we have to remember that Austria and Germany both spoke German. So anything published in Germany could be easily read by an Austrian like Mises.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that's annoying, or annoys me rather, to be fair, is people who may have the economic side of capitalism pretty like well understood, or they are libertarians, right? Like economically right libertarians in nature and everything, but they still have this kind of social egalitarian and like equality doctrine. So even in like a free market system, they would have all jobs being equal in the sense of like if you're providing value, like it's not a big deal. So if you're offering some sort of service in the community, whether you're selling drugs or prostitution or you're just selling like baked goods, these are all like as long as you're profiting, like they can all be viewed equally or something, because they like that part of it. It's like not so hot on that stuff.
And Mises, and it's going to be interesting because Jeffrey Tucker touches on it now, but in the first couple weeks of socialism, we're going to be going directly into why that's not part of capitalism.
Yeah.
So
just before we move on, I'd just like to mention note on the previous thing you said. You mentioned Weimar Germany. I think it's one of the best examples of how just liberal democracy and these leftist groups coming to prominence quickly leads to social degeneracy, which is that the Weimar Germany was the cradle of transsexuality with the German Institute of Sexology, which was opened in 1919. And
Weimar Germany actually created the idea of transsexualism.
Yep. And the people who were behind this concept were all from socialist and social democratic circles. And yeah. They are all related to the left. They were a lot of them were teachers at universities or involved with academia in general. So you can already see this pattern of the anti-capitalist and pro-degenerate left.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I just want to jump in and say this as well, since we have this spot, and I don't think it comes up to be any more relevant than it already was. And I didn't say it earlier, but I was thinking about it. Was just how almost opposite in a way Mises's views are to what libertarianism is described at by Beltway LP types of it's fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And it's like, I think Mises would say it's fiscally liberal in the sense of like laissez-faire, like that meaning like it's socially conservative, because if you're going to say it's antithetical to a socialist view of nature for societal like interactions. Like it's anti-egalitarian. It's you're constantly having to fight what the nature of humanity is in order to accept the social like doctrine of egalitarianism. Like I feel like it's just Mises's views were technically culturally conservative and social, or how do they say it? However they say it, it's like the opposite.
Reactionary?
Right.
Well, yeah, it's certainly reactionary, but just how that's described as,
It wouldn't necessarily be culturally conservative. I would say it's just laissez-faire, because in laissez-faire you do have freedom. However, it's a kind of structured freedom, and this is what the socialists always complain about capitalism and laissez-faire, is that they still have to like work in order to eat and things like that. Yeah. And so it's not that you're taking away freedom. It's just freedom leads itself to structure.
Yeah, like your ability to make use of your freedom depends on your ability to sustain yourself. So the people who adopt lifestyles that are unsustainable, they're not gonna have the material conditions to keep up those lifestyles. So these types of degenerate lifestyles, which are often not, almost always rooted in low time preference, they don't really lead to any kind of success in a market economy. And that's why these people are so prone to being anti-capitalists. And this is what we discussed in the last book.
And the reason they're so prevalent today is because they're kept on life support by the policies of the state. And they're certainly incentivized and encouraged in many ways, but some of the self-destructive behaviors people engage in, they're only able to maintain them for as long as they do because they're subsidized by the state.
Yep. I mean, to quote Spandrel real quick, the reason there are so many evil fat women in government is because if the government didn't want them, where else would they be? Right.
I've never heard that. That's really good.
It's bio-Leninism.
Yep. So yeah. Also, just to add to what Bert said when he said that libertarianism is actually fiscally liberal, you'd be right, and this is also something we briefly covered in the last book. But the term liberal has been like completely extrapolated and appropriated by the left, more so in America than in Europe, but since today's world is so centered around American politics, it's basically becoming a universal thing where the term liberal is just completely associated with the left, and the original meaning is totally lost. And you have to specify when you're talking about classical liberalism or English liberalism.
Right. Oh, for sure. And it's not a term I would ever use. It's just funny when maybe Gary Johnson types say, like they try to give you the elevator pitch and they say libertarianism's fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And it's like, man, that's not it at all.
Yeah. All right, let's go on.
Alright, yeah, so when speaking of sex, Mises notes it is more important to women than to men. For men, sex brings them relaxation and mental peace, but for women, this is the start of the burden of motherhood. Her life is circumscribed by sex. A man is always above the sexual in the relationship. This is why women are contemptuous of men that are engrossed by sex. Don't know if there's anything to add there.
Yeah, he's just explaining how sex impacts the different, how it impacts men and women differently, and it just adding to the explanation that he gave previously about how they have different roles in the social division of labor.
Yep. So, let's continue. Mises saw the fate of whole civilizations hinging on their attitude towards the relations of the sexes. The proper attitude establishes cooperation between the sexes. The improper view destroyed the Orient. Every progressive movement began with prematurely frustrated women and dragged men down to the miasma of harem. The Orients have never been able to free themselves in sexual matters, and this has sealed the fates of their culture. Similarly, the Greeks have erred by excluding the married woman from culture. The Greek man's love went to mistresses exclusively, and when that wasn't enough, he turned to homosexual love. Plato saw the love of boys transfigured by the spiritual union of lovers. To Plato, the love of woman was a gross sensual satisfaction. I don't know who's doing that, but could you stop, putting your cursor where I'm reading?
I'm sorry. I'm trying to follow along and I'm not thinking about it.
Yeah. Prostitution contradicts the cooperative of the pre-capitalistic age, not a symptom of a higher culture. It was the ideal of capitalism that contributed to producing the demand for a... Sorry. It was the ideal of capitalism that contributed to producing the demand for man's abstinence outside of marriage by insisting on equal moral rights for man and woman. Thus, capitalism discourages prostitution, and he applies his whatever is in accord with man's nature, such as man's sexual fidelity in marriage, is fostered by the only economic system, capitalism, that is also in accord with man's nature.
Yep. I think an interesting observation is that what's happening today in the West is pretty much the opposite of what he mentions here about with Asia, the Orient, and ancient Greece, which he says that, you know, ancient Greece and the Orient, they basically eliminated women from culture. They basically said that, you know, women are supposed to be mothers and they make children, and that's about it, and the rest is like irrelevant. And in the West nowadays, it's like pretty much the opposite. Instead of trying to eliminate women from culture, they're trying to force women into culture and eliminate motherhood.
Right, and they're also eliminating men from culture. And it's going to be interesting because this is based on the book we're going to be reading soon, and so it's going to be interesting to see what Mises's full argument here is. Because this is at least this section is a summary of what Mises is writing in some chapters of the next book. So we're going to be able to see what his full... by equalizing... Oh, and one thing I also liked about this is that he shows that human nature isn't contradictory, essentially. That the economic system that is in accord with man's nature also will encourage things that are a part of man's nature generally, not just in terms of economics.
Yeah.
By equalizing all outcomes, socialism might be able to remove the economic temptation to prostitution, but it would not solve the problems caused by the sexual instinct. This is just kind of going back to what I just said. By destroying the natural order, socialism can't deal with how men deal with their sexual instinct to mature it beyond a pure animalistic instinct.
Yep. And I'll just add here my personal input, which is that, you know, the capitalist and unregulated economy, and especially without any form of welfare or social justice, it's a good thing that the people who willingly engage in these types of lifestyles are denied economic prosperity.
So, Mises viewed marriage as an inescapable social institution. Marriage reigns in the sexual instincts of man, and allows women to achieve what nature and biology tells us is her primary occupation, bearing children and caring for the family. Socialists seek to combat marriage just as they wish to justify the abolition of private property. Marxists claim capitalism creates every imaginable evil, including that of marriage and man's domination over women.
Yep.
I just have to say, based in red pilled on what a woman's primary occupation is.
Yep.
Mises saw two phases of history in the relations between the sexes. One of violence and one of capitalism. During the age of violence, male aggressiveness, which is implicit in the very nature of sexual relations, is here carried out to the extreme. The man seizes possession of the woman, and holds so in the same sense as he holds other objects of the material world. Here, woman is completely a thing, something that can be stolen and bought, given away, sold away, and ordered away. Where the principle of violence reigns, polygamy is universal. And I think this really helps complete what I've seen many priests talk about when it comes to polygamy and violence, is they can see a correlation between polygamy and violence, but they can't figure out why, it seems like. They never really explain like why polygamy has to relate to violence, and I think this is a really good explanation of why. It's not that polygamy creates violence per se, it's that violence creates polygamy, and so it's polygamy is a symptom of a deeper failing.
Yeah, polygamy. I guess polygamy is more prominent in environments of violence, in environments in which societal norms have been abandoned, and thus those who are stronger and those who are able to, hoard property are going to have more of things, and in this case it basically equates women to property. So just only the people who are stronger are going to have as many as they want, and that's naturally related with how violent they are towards other males.
Yep.
I think there's also a good parallel here, which is if you just look at the Middle East, which is basically what this is describing, and you shouldn't need more than this to disregard the whole based Islam thing, and we just like based Iran and etc. Those places are all like extremely violent, and they are very, very riddled with polygamy and other forms of sexual degeneracy, even if those things go against some of their religious principles.
And even some of the laws. I mean, Iran has a bunch of transsexuals inside of its cities, and it's illegal. But what is it? Tehran is the transsexual surgery capital of the world.
Yep.
So I mean,
something like that.
So I mean, this is why I dislike the whole abolitionist sentiment that many traditionalists have, is because it's a cultural fight. It's not a state fight. Now, I understand if it's if something's actually harming someone, that you'd want to make it illegal, but it wouldn't. But things that only hurt your own body or your own soul, I don't really see.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, I'm a little bit probably on more extreme on this topic than most libertarians, even in our circle. I think that it's just a good thing, actually, if you have practices and lifestyles that are not necessarily violent or aggressive towards other individuals, but that are bad to those who practice it. Not only do I think these things should not be prohibited, I think they should, we should actively support their decriminalization, because, first of all, just get that problem out of the way. It's on like the practical sense, you're not wasting more money, you're not wasting regulation, you're not wasting state power on those issues, but also the people who willingly engage in those self-destructive behaviors and lifestyles, it's entirely their problem, and if anything, they're just helping accelerate the natural process of evolution.
Yep.
That's just my take.
Yeah, no, it's just a yeah.
So yeah, bro, if
It's
you
also
wanna do heroin, go ahead. You're the one who's gonna be out of the gene pool.
yeah. Um, I like Matt's well, yeah. Anyways, so this situation cannot endure any more than socialism can endure. The sexual act is a give and take thing, and the suffering attitude in the woman diminishes man's pleasure. To satisfy himself, he must awaken her response. To achieve this, the man who outwardly appears the unlimited master of his woman is not so powerful in the house as he thinks. He must concede part of his rule to the woman, even though he ashamedly conceals this from the world.
Yep.
The age of violence was against nature because the characteristic of love, the overvaluation of the object, cannot exist when women hold the position of contempt. The onset of capitalism corrected this by bringing the relationship between the sexes more in line with nature. Society started to see marital relations as a contract which makes the wife and a partner with equal rights. Marriage thus becomes a mutual agreement where the woman wins the role in the home which she holds today. I don't know if I entirely agree with Mises here that women should have the role in the home that she holds today. I will note that he's writing in 1922 and he might not be talking about like issues that have come up in the last 50 years.
Yep.
But what he's talking about here, that a man gives up his role to the woman, that's actually so true in the conservative parts of my family, that the women actually rule the men and the men just kind of make the money for the woman to manage.
Yeah, I think that in the recent years, especially after World War II, and after the boomer generation, it's become increasingly difficult for families to maintain themselves with a single source of income, which was not as much of a problem the in the
Well,
early 20th century, most likely, or at least a lot of people don't want to give up the urban lifestyles and stuff, so they have to put up with increased living costs and stuff. So,
right.
in some situations, it's impossible for the man to be the only source of income, but in a lot of ways, it still is. And yeah, in that case, I guess I agree.
Well, yeah. There's reasons before that beyond just, capitalism leads to that. It's not only is it because women are going to college and getting student loan debt, but it's mostly just people want to have a certain amount of wealthy living, and so they cut back on children in order to do that, and the woman
Oh, no, I just want to make clear, I don't think that the introduction of women to the workforce is a natural byproduct of capitalism. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's very, very clear that the entrance of women in the workforce was not only orchestrated, but blatantly anti-capitalistic.
yeah, and so
First of all, it
the
comes with the wars, right? The world
Mm-hmm.
wars, which if you're gonna argue that the world wars were capitalistic, just get out of here. But yeah, just this insanely Keynesian idea of conscripting the men to go to war and then all the women go to the industry because you have to keep everybody employed and you have to keep production going, and all of that's of course funded by the government, and then you have these massive amount of debt being created, and now everybody's already in the workforce, so you can't just send all the women away, and now you have the workforce almost doubled in just a couple of decades, and you have wages for non-managerial jobs just like plunging. So that was obviously just a product of some insanely Keynesian state measures, state policies and stuff.
Right. I think, and it's hard to say alternative history, but I think without, a nation that had like the Federal Reserve manipulating the money supply and devaluing the purchasing power, and then instituting wars and everything. I mean, you could have seen women never enter the workforce, especially the way that technology and labor-saving devices make people so much better at raising living standards and everything. I mean,
right. The main issue that the traditionalists have is that the living standards for the average family wouldn't improve if both the husband and wife weren't both working. Like if it was just the man, the average family would be the same level as they would be in the 1950s. Oh, sorry, 1960s. And so they see this as the problem, but that's not, even with that being true, it doesn't force women to become part of the workforce. It's just a shift in valuation of women wanting more material goods to wanting to stay home with the children.
Yeah.
Yeah, and plus, once you double the amount of people in the workforce, you also double the tax base for the state, so they're almost incentivized to keep women in the workforce.
Yeah, the whole economic and social degradation, as we discussed, is just, completely tied. You can't just disconnect one from the other. You have this top-down influence of the state pushing for more and more workers and more taxes and more public spending, which incentivized this. And you also have the bottom-up, quote-unquote bottom-up influence of cultural Marxism and feminism, which was just, destroying the roots of our civilization, destroying these institutions of marriage and of traditional gender roles. So you also have these great grand groups of people who want to give up their motherhood and become workers.
Right.
So they willingly integrate into the workforce because they've been taught that it's the best thing for them, when in reality it just isn't.
Yeah, well, it's like the Marxist propaganda of like workers being the most like highly venerated class, and motherhood being constantly looked at as
motherhood just got completely shunned. Like, being a mother is like, nowadays being a mother is pretty much like a hobby. It's like something that's completely overshadowed by having a career, and so you have women that just go to school and then they get thousands of dollars in debt to go to college, and then they spend like their entire 20s trying to build up a career, and then like when they're almost 40, that's when they have money and they have time, and they decide to pick up motherhood as a hobby, and by then they're mostly unfit for such.
Yeah, almost all their eggs are gone.
Yeah.
Hollywood demands the egg sacrifice.
And it's hard to ignore all the cultural and then the state policies that encourage this sort of thing. Like, you can even just look at like in the housing sector, how much harder it is to buy a house because of all the regulations and everything they put into that, like how much inflates the housing.
Right, and so
housing bubble and stuff. So it's like you kind of, if you want to afford like a decent place to live, it's pretty much impossible without both parents working, because of the way, and they've been indoctrinated in public education that you need to go take on this massive amount of debt when you're 18 years old, and all this stuff. Like, this is all state sponsored to keep women out of the home.
Yep. And if you want to go look at the opposite example, I mentioned that I'm using Liechtenstein as an example in my article about trade and immigration that I'm working on. This is one of the things that I cover. Liechtenstein has hardly any trade barriers. It has one of the countries, the world's most deregulated economies. You know, and they have hardly any trade barriers with other European countries, and they make up for that by having very, very restrictive immigration policies. But also, they have some of Europe's lowest taxes, and they have their income tax is like almost half of Germany's, and so is their VAT and other things like that. But on top of all of that, they have 12,000 Swiss franc deductions in taxes, which is over $13,000 for each minor child. So
Yep.
they are incentivizing motherhood and incentivizing natural populational growth, not by the state doing something, but by taking the government out of motherhood, out of marriage.
Okay. Yeah, just a note for future reference, we really need to start wrapping up these tangents much quicker.
Yep, sorry about that.
So, all modern ideals of marriage grow out of contract. This can be seen in divorce law, where men cannot simply cast off a woman which man once possessed. Mises notes the church takes the lead in the struggle against divorce, but it should remember that the existence of the modern marriage ideal of monogamy is the result of capitalist, not ecclesiastical development. And that's an interesting thought. I don't know if that's true or not. We'll see. We'll see in the coming weeks the sources on this, essentially.
Yep.
Because Mises is going to have sources in socialism that's not covered here. So Mises also replied to the socialist and libertine claim that since some geniuses rejected marriage, that must call into question the validity of the institution. The reply is that genius does not allow itself to be hindered by any consideration for the comfort of its fellow, even those closest to it. The ties of marriage become intolerable bonds which the genius tries to cast off or at least loosen so as to move freely. Rarely is he granted a woman willing and able to go with him on his solitary path. The masses accepted it so completely that anyone who betrayed his wife felt himself entitled to justify his action in these terms. But the true genius is rare, and a social institution does not become impossible merely because one or two exceptional men are unable to adjust themselves to it. So, yeah, I don't see a giant issue here. I can get some men really have struggle with marriage. And actually, something that the West basically has given up, especially Protestantism, but the East really has a tradition of, is monastic life, which might be more fitting to these geniuses. Socialists also use the happiness of some marriages to question the institution. Only marriage has set up the permanent satisfaction of desire as an ideal, much to its credit. We cannot blame marriage because it is unable to change our lives into an infinite series of ecstatic moments. Romantic love tends to fade slowly and unnoticeably to be replaced with friendly affection, only interrupted by occasional flickering of the old love. Living together becomes habitual, and there are many joys and there are many blessings of bearing children and raising them. So that's what replaces the romantic love of the early relationship. However, it's interesting to note Father Josiah Trenholm actually says that you should try to keep this romantic love going because it gives your children a clear understanding of where they came from. Like why they came to be, essentially. No other German socialist book is as widely read or more effective as propaganda as August Bebel's book Woman and Socialism, which is dedicated to the message of free love. Free love is the socialist's radical solution for sexual problems. Choice in love becomes entirely free, and men and women separate just as come together and separate just as their urges desire. All children are nurtured, maintained, and educated by the state. The response of the moral theologian is entirely inadequate, as radical sexual freedom is not in the interest of men or women. I think he's talking about here where moral theologians would say that this is entirely men trying to get what they want. And Mises just disagrees that this is in the interest of men. Free love debases sexuality and reduces beauty and sensuality to promiscuity and force. It is only marriage that unites a man and a woman as equal, freeborn companions and comrades. The contract allows a woman to deny herself anyone and to demand fidelity and constancy from the man to whom she gives herself. Free love wars against nature, as do all pseudo-democratic efforts to efface natural and socially conditioned inequalities. In their goal for absolute equality, socialists pursue a consistent pattern. The work to make women the equal of men, a goal which nature will not allow. So, any thoughts here?
No, really.
With regard to state childcare that free love advocates demand, Mises wrote that to take away a woman's children is to take away part of her life, and children are deprived of the most far-reaching influences when they are torn from the bosom of the family. For a child to grow up to be a healthy human being, the parents must teach their child to love. That is why state childcare leads to neurosis and homosexuality. And I like how that became somewhat controversial on Twitter a day or two ago.
Yeah.
I think that statement is hilarious and triggering.
Yep. So it's gonna be funny to see the full argument, and when we post that on Twitter, it's gonna be fun to see all of the libertarians just lose their minds for another 5 weeks.
I can't wait for the polyamory to end.
I don't know. I think we should write an article saying that polyamory is a revolt against nature, just to keep it going.
Based. I'll do it. And I'll justify helicopter rides for people who engage in polyamory.
Yep. So-
It's certainly a revolt against civilization, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's actually, if you read Socialism, the full arguments of why it's based on violence, or why violence leads to it, you're going to be able to make a libertarian case against polyamory and why it violates, why it comes about through violations of the NAP.
I saw that one quote not long ago. I can also reference a short history of man as to why polyamory and polygamy are degenerations rather than progress in, sexual relations.
So, yeah, go ahead and write that article, and we can stoke the flame more.
That'll be fun.
It's also funny because you haven't said anything about polyamory for 5 weeks, and they're still going on about it. You're living
I know.
You're living
Really-
rent free.
It really goes to show them where their priorities are.
Yep.
Like,
Paying
I feel
attention
like-
to my dumb tweets.
I feel like even as like a libertarian anarchist would have like the reaction if you said something about like, well, you know, I'm a minarchist, so I think maybe we should definitely have a national standing defense, and most libertarians would be like, even ANCAPs would be like, yeah, you know, whatever, but like they wouldn't care as much. But then if you're like, yeah, I don't really like polyamory, like it shows you what they have real passionate about, like, or you know, like that really stepped on someone's toes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine what libertarians could accomplish if they cared about war and the Fed as much as they did polyamory.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. Just tweet out again. I'm hang all polygamists. Okay, so I believe this is Bort's section, and I'm going to be right back. So go ahead, Bort.
All right. So the section starts out with the title "Feminism as a Revolt Against Nature," which is just awesome. It's such a good title. And it basically starts, and this is a quote Kyle read earlier. This is the section it's from, where Mises makes a distinction between two types of equality. One he calls equality where the law must treat everyone impartially, and one that wages war on nature by demanding natural and societal inequality to be eliminated. And by the pursuit of the second, it always eliminates the first. We covered this earlier, but this is how the beginning of this section starts. I don't know if this is going to get too much of a tangent, but I think I even disagree with Mises on even equality before the law, and maybe not on the principle of what he means, but just I think I might just go back to the lending too much credence to the left. Like technically speaking, like I don't know if I accept equality before the law as a principle either, but I think I know what Mises was meaning when he said that as far as the rule of law, but like we kind of covered this. I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that.
Well, I think this is only related to how legally recognized citizens are treated before the law, and not so much regarding, you know, what specific laws are in place. So you could still disagree with the majority of the laws that we have today, while believing that, you know, citizens should be treated equally, as to allow for more natural social division of labor.
Yeah, I'm probably just getting too lost in the words. I just think about it from the context of like what a law is, or just a contract law, how it's almost making a separate law just between you and someone else, where it automatically creates an uneven legal system. Because it's not necessarily against the law for me to not give you $10, but by creating a contract that said I would do so in exchange for some action or some labor, like that's almost creating like a private law that only applies to us.
Yeah.
You know, but that's probably just getting too lost in it. But I mean, I just think like really hammering down and getting specific this way. If you just start walking around saying you believe equality before the law, I feel like you leave the door open. Like I understand what his writing is at the time. I'm just saying maybe like since then I wouldn't say that going forward personally.
All right.
Okay. By trying to achieve equal outcomes, you must have the state enforce laws unequally. Socialists advocate equality based on the assumption that all are equal in nature. This is the basis for why Mises rejected feminism. Yeah, so socialists, they live by the concept that all men are created equally. And if there's any situation where they're unequal in practice, something nefarious has occurred, because they are, by their definition, all meant to be equal by, you know, some cosmic force. So if they're not equal in result, something must have happened.
Yep.
Feminists of the 19th century believed in the abolition of marriage as it could be reformed, or excuse me, feminists of the 19th century believed in the abolition of marriage as it could not be reformed, excuse me, because it was oppressive in nature, as they claimed the role of the woman was to sacrifice her freedom while it gave men space to grow.
Mario actually has something to say. He says, two things. I support polyamory because it kills the degenerates faster. He also says equality before the law is more of a classically liberal concept, and that is true. You'll see that rule of law is also in Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty, and almost no person that believes in natural rights can really get away from rule of law. Hoppe has a really good argument against this. It's related to his argumentation ethics, but he shows that ethical rules must be universal, otherwise they are based on violence and not argumentation, and which is the very foundation of his argumentation ethics. So
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, there can't be a rules for me and rules for the masses. There has to be rules for everyone to abide by. In principle, classical liberalism is supposed to be about that, and even absolutists, when they were trying to get away from the feudal order, made arguments like this. But the inherent contradiction between classical liberalism and absolutism and the rule of law really shows that the only time rule of law can really happen is in a natural aristocracy.
Yeah, I guess.
So,
All right. If anyone's anything else to say, I'm going to continue.
yeah, it's also interesting that well, hearing this nebulous freedom, in this rule of woman, you're not hearing the structured freedom that we were talking about. And my article on Konkin actually talks about this, where it's having no hierarchy, having no structure in your society. That's not really freedom. It's not really individualism either.
Yeah, it's just a more like definition switching type stuff where freedom means different things to different people.
Yeah, and it's basically a semantic trick.
Right, exactly.
So anyway, let's continue.
They believed what should replace it was loose relations which gave freedom to both parties. He believed that the expansion of females' power and abilities was not inhibited by children or marriage, but biology itself. So, yeah, this is... Okay, you go ahead.
Actually, you should go ahead, because I already said my piece.
Okay, well, I was just going to basically just reiterate, yeah, so this is just responding to the feminists of the 19th century who thought things where they were able to achieve in society was hindered by their role as a mother or as a wife in a marriage, and Mises is arguing that their inability, that where their power in society is inhibited by nature and biology, not by those institutions. And he would probably argues the counter that those institutions are actually what help sustain and empower their natural roles in nature.
Yeah, and this is basically just Mises talking about structured liberty again. And a lot of the structures actually comes from human nature and from biology. People aren't experts in everything, and so they need a hierarchy so they can rationally leave the opinion making essentially to someone they can trust.
Yep. That is the fundamental difference between the left and the right, is the acknowledgement of hierarchy as natural.
Is Fort picking up for you guys as well?
Yeah, a little bit.
What was the question?
Is Fort breaking up for you guys as well?
Oh,
Yeah, he was
every
a
now
little
and
bit,
then.
but it was still intelligible.
Okay.
which just means that I'm really intelligent. All right. Of the demand for racial, or excuse me, we're going to get there. That's coming up. Of the demand for radical equality, Mises says that the difference between sexual character and sexual destiny can no more be decreased or decreed away than other inequalities of mankind. It is not marriage which keeps women inwardly unfree, but the fact that her sexual character demands surrender to a man and that her love for husband and children consumes her best energies. So, he's basically saying that you can't use like a top-down declaration to change like the nature of the sexes any more than you can any other inequalities between people with regards to any like IQ or height or whatever.
Because we're talking about
This-
nature here, you can no more decree the equality of men than you can decree that the world is flat if it is round, or that it is round if it is flat.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the famous I forget what trial it is, but there was a show trial back in monarchic times that a man was being tried for silence when he was asked if the king had absolute power, and he said, "Is it?" He tried to bring up the natural law, and he said, "Can the king's decree make the world flat if it is round? And can any act of legislation by the legislature make it round if it is flat?" He's just trying to appeal to the people who are paid to kill him through this trial. Appeal to their just knowledge that there's nothing you can write down on a piece of paper that is going to change reality.
Right.
And he was killed anyways, but he knew he was going to be killed, so he just made a speech for posterity's sake.
Yeah,
So-
this is kind of the this is kind of the whole socialist game, is to engineer and change basic human nature through through the state in many ways, of course, but then also even people who don't they just try to do it through complete societal pressure, is trying to completely rewire and change people's natural inclinations as being wrong, and you need to, try to re-engineer society.
It's also interesting that he says that homosexual character demand surrender to man, and that her love for husband and children consumes her best energies. And it's just like, yeah, that's the beginning of Genesis right there. So it's kind of interesting that even though Mises wasn't a Christian, he is basically just agreeing with the holy books here.
Yeah. Well, there's some underlying universal truth, I think, that can be recognized by all,
You're right. So the idea, especially in Catholicism, I haven't studied Orthodoxy that as much to know if this is true for them as well, but God doesn't say things are good or the way they are good because he's God and he can just determine what's good or bad. He says they are good because they are good for other reasons, and he's just letting us know that this is good or that's bad. So
he goes on to say, "There's no human law.
Yep.
There is no human law to prevent the woman who looks for happiness in a career from renouncing love and marriage. But those who do not renounce them are not left with sufficient strength to master life as a man may master it. It is a fact that sex possesses her whole personality and not the facts of marriage and family which enchains a woman. By abolishing marriage, one would not make women feel any freer and happier. One would merely take from her the essential content of her life, and one could offer nothing to replace it.
Yep.
This is apparent even, like, especially today, where people think, and this is what this whole chapter's been talking about, but the traditional marriage roles and having to become a mother is this oppressive kind of like predetermined slot for your life that it's really liberating to not fall into, and you can throw those things to the wind and break out and be a single, independent woman. And you see so many cases where women turn, 40 years old or something, and they look and they have nothing, no one to share their life with, and they have nothing to, they don't have kids or anything. And but the what you're sold it on it being when you're younger is this is like a liberating and freeing thing that goes against, like, this is going against society, but it's really, you're replacing it with nothing, and they're not enrich. It's not enriching their life. Like, these aren't chains you're getting rid of. This is what keeps them, keeps you stable and keeps you happy.
And this harkens back to my section where he says sex is way more important to women than it is to men, and that's why sex possesses her whole personality, and that's why it's the single most important thing in a woman's life, because it begins the burden of child rearing.
Mm-hmm. Pregnancy and the nursing of children claim the best years of a woman's life, the years in which a man may spend his energies in great achievements. One may believe that the unequal distribution of the burden of reproduction is an injustice of nature. And you can clearly see they do. They do believe that. That's because it's not equally distributed, the roles.
Right. So many men, especially like if you look at scientists or economists, they make their best the best contributions to the field in their 20s and 30s. Meanwhile, women, as Molyneux points out, should in their 20s and 30s be raising children, and then in their 40s they can, figure out a career after that.
Yep. Yeah, I gave an example.
And it goes to this chapter being called "Feminism as a Revolt Against Nature," and I mean that's a exact demonstration of what they're talking about here. Is, and it ties once again in with feminism just being a form of egalitarianism, like a specific kind, which Rothbard's essay with the similar title, of course, as a reference, just to show you this urge from socialists to inevitably want to make everything equal. Just grappling with the reality of nature, you're going to find quote unquote injustices and inequalities everywhere, whether it is economic, as a lot of socialists are focused on, but even in the cultural and societal things of like raising children, yes, the roles aren't equal and they're not balanced, so they view this as injustice and an unequal thing to be corrected or to be opposed. And it's instead of embracing it and understanding it as part of a natural order.
Yeah, socialists and collectivists in general have this almost fascination with this abstract concept of a nation or a society that functions like a machine, and it's just all the pieces are the same and all the pieces have an equal or an equivalent role, and it's completely incompatible with nature's organic model. It's almost like a fantastical in the unrealistic sense fascination. Yeah.
And it's why they, as stated earlier, they have to battle with nature. Yeah. They have to be combative with it, because just letting nature take its course and letting spontaneous things happen, I mean, that results in
that results in
it
results in all the things they hate.
Yep.
So
Mises summarized his position on feminism. Are you about to say something?
No, I was about to say go ahead. And
Okay, I figured that's what I thought. Mises summarized his position on feminism by distinguishing between the claim that a woman be granted an equal legal position with that of men and the claim of absolute equality. This is basically the creed of economic socialism applied to gender and culture. Yep, great summary. It is when you say feminism, and this is the Trojan horse. This is the language and the code switching of treating men and women equal legal positions versus equality just wholesale.
Yeah.
And that's how they sell it to you in one way with the language saying, do you agree men and women should be equal? And maybe in the context of the larger sentence you could agree. And then they said, okay, well earlier you said they should be equal, so by that logic, equal pay, and then whatever that means. It's this language game of how they manipulate, which is why he's distinguishing. It's important to distinguish, but it's why, from a strategic standpoint, today all of us need to not use or be very careful about how we word things to not even give them the impression that we are agreeing with their conclusions.
Yeah.
Right. I think that so the church, the Orthodox Church, has clearly defined rules for a husband and wife. However, when you're listening to John Chrysostom, directly after he's talking about the roles of women and men and how men are the head of the household as Christ is the head of the church, he'll talk about the equality between men and women, and he's not talking about you can have two heads in a marriage. He's talking about how they're equal roles even if they fulfill different roles in the marriage.
Equal roles, they're balanced. They're
right.
even roles.
And this is even true of let's say the clergy and the laity. So in the church, you're considered to be a part of the body of the church, but some people might be the feet and some people might be the hands. And just because you do not walk on your hands or you do not write with your feet does not mean that you hate your feet or hate your hands.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
the individual characteristics of people and of groups, I guess collective characteristics of groups, are largely what define what role they take up on the natural social division of labor. And by trying to just make everyone equal, you're destroying some of those roles or creating artificial ones. It's like you're trying to make a band, and you just try to make everybody a guitar player, just so everyone's the same. And they argue on the basis that the bass player doesn't get enough recognition, or the vocalist doesn't even get an instrument. That's unfair. And then you take that away and forcibly make everything the same, and in the process you've destroyed the band.
Right.
That was probably not the best analogy, but...
Well, it makes sense, because to have a band requires different roles in an orchestra even, and to say that they're all unequal, like the person playing the drums isn't equal to the person playing the violin. It's like they all play a different role in the end result. But
yeah, they're specific.
It's like it's not even. Yeah, you need them all to have the end. But it's not that they're unequal. I mean, they technically are different, but it's not like some injustice has occurred. That's the important part. Is that no one's been cheated here. I mean, like Jordan Peterson talks about this with relevance to career choices now, about how, and he refers to they always talk about in the Scandinavian countries about how it's more socially, egalitarian. They always push those sorts of things. And even there, with all these programs and all these incentives, that men and women basically sort themselves into the same categories anyway, of men being in more engineering fields and women being in more caretaking fields. It just naturally, that's what people are inclined to. But some people look at this and look at these the facts of these differences and think because there's not enough women in these higher paying or CEO positions, that someone's been cheated, that there's all these women who want to be CEOs and they've been stolen from necessarily. And it's like a lot of people, they just have different desires in nature. Like it's biologically, they're not driven towards those things.
Right, and I think this next little bit is going to help at least move along this conversation here.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I had written here, it is a part of socialism to want to reform nature. And then I just wrote, restore the natural order under that in my notes. Efforts to enlist females on the side of liberty would be doomed to failure because there are fundamental disagreements on the limitations of nature.
To enlist feminists, not females, just to
I said females. Yeah. I said females. Yes, of course, feminists.
At this point, like, what's the difference? But yeah.
Yeah, but that is true to say that people who are feminists in meaning what they mean when they say it.
Yeah.
So it is fairly true that females that do not have a lifelong partner, whether they're married or not married, can't really be on the side of liberty because it is the man's ability to provide for the family that will mean that they will benefit from liberty. Because if you're a single woman, you are in a vulnerable position because anytime you have sex, you can have children, which require you to both raise them and provide. And a woman can't do both. So if she doesn't have a husband, she'll want to get married to the state, which is the opposite of what liberty would entail.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and then his clarification as well. It's just their fundamental disagreements on the limitations of nature.
Right. This would be their nature as well.
Right. Exactly. And it's just so funny to picture Mises in like 1920, or I don't know exactly when this specific quotes are pulled from, but just saying, just looking at feminists and being like, oh yeah, we're not doing this. This is a completely waste of time. Like I'm not even going to bother.
Yep.
So funny.
Yep.
Okay. Mises reserved his harshest criticism for the political ends of feminism. He regarded the laws against women's suffrage and their election to public office as largely expressing what is inherently true.
Yep. There's a great section about this at the end where he summarizes a lot of the points. And we can get more into that when we get there, which he makes a great case against female suffrage. So I think we can just wait until the final summary for that discussion.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we'll move into the next section, race and ethnicity. Mises' cultural tradition. Sorry, go ahead.
Spicy.
Oh, yeah. So Mises' cultural traditionalism also led him to oppose egalitarianism as regards to the traits distinctive to particular racial and ethnic groups. He believed that all human beings are inherently unequal, and that these inequalities can be generalized according to the social patterns that develop in terms of race and ethnicity.
Obviously, he's just talking about like skin tones and not anything beneath the skin.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in this section that he mentions, which, I mean, it's completely fair, but he mentions how there are some things that a lot of the racial studies that were available at the time were dubious, and that while he disagreed with them because they were dubious, he fully supported the right to research, race and ethnicity. And I think nowadays we have a lot more scientific background behind race studies and stuff. So, we're able to draw better conclusions from science now than we were back then. You just have to be able to, pick and choose what you trust.
Right, and it's also interesting that biologists are having to use funding for studies that are not necessarily for race to study race because no one will fund it, especially the state. The state will not fund it, which you would think that, if the conclusions of just studying race and whatever trait you're trying to look at would be favorable to the state's egalitarian ethos, they would. But the fact that they won't kind of tells you that the science isn't in favor of egalitarianism.
No, the cathedral perpetuates itself, and
Yeah, I was about to say that the cathedral has an inherently egalitarian ideal, which requires race denialism, and that's why it's become so prominent in the media, especially. So you have nowadays a lot of whenever you see mentions of race in the media, and they are talking about disparity and inequality and etc., they will almost address or not almost, they will address race as if it were an entirely a social construct. They will deny the existence of race even on a scientific basis at this point. Yep. And that's completely absurd.
It's completely postmodernism.
Yep. If you go back to the origins of race and the classification of the racial groups in the human species, you have definitions of race that are almost or even entirely synonymous to subspecies. So if you just go back in time and look at all of these early reports on race, you have different human races being classified in the same way that we now classify breeds of dogs, for instance. So now we're reaching the point where that's beyond unforgivable, and the whole concept of race is being disregarded as a social construct.
Yep.
Yeah, along with gender being a social construct and everything else that postmodernism seeks to conflate.
Well, yeah, as who's that postmodernist guy that debated Bob Murphy not too long ago?
Thaddeus Russell.
Thaddeus Russell. As he puts it, all social categorization is a social construct and not really useful.
Yeah. And you know what's funny is that this battle against categorization and differentiation between groups, which is ultimately a battle on in-group preference, right? They want to destroy in-group preference in order to conflate all of society into this one big mush of slaves. And what's funny about it is that this, while they are actively fighting against the concept of race and racial groups, they need to use these very concepts in order to identify the groups that they want to point to as the causes of the problems. So they'll say, no, race doesn't exist. Race is a social construct. Gender doesn't exist. Gender is a social construct. And then they'll point to us and say, no, white males are the problem. So they are using these constructs in order to antagonize people at the same time that they're actively rejecting them.
Yeah, well, I don't believe they actually believe in a lot of the doctrines they claim they do, or they don't operate as if they do, but they profess to believe in them. I mean, I think Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about this a lot in Getting Libertarianism Right, where the left acts as if people, or they claim that all people are created equal, but they don't behave as if they are. But they still have to express that as a goal or desire. But based on their actions, they clearly don't believe that, or else they wouldn't be exclusively anti-white.
Yep.
All right. So let's continue. From the outset, Mises condemned the theory of racial determinism and rigid racial categorization, especially when it was defended by pseudoscience. Mises ruled out the idea that races can be measured against a pure standard.
So he's going to talk a lot again about how Mises was against the use of racial studies in defense of government state discrimination against groups. So he's going to repeatedly defend the right for these studies to exist and take place, but also going to condemn and any attempts to use them as a basis for systemic discrimination and violations of the rule of law.
Right,
Well,
exactly. And
it's also going to be interesting because the two states in the 20th century that did this the most were both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And neither one would actually use valid things like IQ tests. Nazi Germany developed a kind of cultural history test to ask them like who is Bismarck, who is this, which is not really an IQ test because an IQ test doesn't test historical knowledge. It tests your ability to find patterns, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, at least that's one of the things it tests. And so he's right that a lot of people in his time were not using actual science to have some type of racial superiority over others. But it's not like these things can't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Mises was just strictly speaking, from just his praxeological understanding of methodological individualism, that only an individual acts. So to have these like rigid categorizations that like, yes, this is how this group acts, was kind of anti-scientific in that.
It's a difference between the rigid determinism that doesn't allow for free will, and Mises's determinism, which he explains in a different book, that includes free will and is just saying like your biology and nature and things like that influence what you're going to be able to do.
Yep.
It's also interesting that like the racial science conferences actually disbarred Nazi scientists from their conferences because it was recognized that they weren't actual scientists. They were basically just going along with whatever political agenda the Nazis had.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the Soviet scientists, too.
And the same thing with the scientists today, who are just going along with whatever doctrine they're supposed to upkeep. How Bill Nye is a scientist, but he'll go on TV and talk and just push like transgenderism as being like scientifically backed and just whatever. Like he's just reading off of the cathedral's like playbook.
Yeah,
And
Mario said here in chat that Bill Nye literally made a video saying that race is just skin tones, and
so
that's complete bullshit to anyone who knows anything.
Yeah, he's also made videos about how clumps of cells with like pro-abortion videos, and about all like the gender thing I was talking about, then the racial thing. Like this is science, quote unquote. This is state funded, an agenda that's being put out by quote unquote like the top professionals. That's why we just need to reject the lab coats.
He's not even really a scientist, just like I'm not really a scientist. He has a master's degree in mechanical engineering.
Yeah, he works for Boeing.
Yeah. If he were to come out and talk about like thermodynamics or something like that, that would be completely fine. Just like if I was to come out and talk about like either statistics or signal processing, because that's really what my background is in. Like, we can be considered quote unquote authorities on this.
I'm something of a statistician myself.
But it's not a big trying to say that this guy knows a little bit about science, or has a specialization, therefore he's a generalist that he can talk about any scientific thing is just wrong. And it's
right. These are the court intellectuals that Rothbard's talking about that weave the state apologia.
Yep.
Growing up with Bill Nye, and then seeing like the last several years of what he's been doing, really
makes you question what you learned in school.
I know inertia is probably not even a property of matter. kidding. It's in the intro. All right.
I know exactly what you're talking about because in my AP Physics class in high school, my teacher had a 15-minute lecture on that exact quote from the intro.
All right, I'm going to continue unless everyone else has anything to say about that stuff. As a determinant in the course of world events, people's association with a nation defined in terms of language is of great importance when compared to the slight significance that race plays in shaping cultural and political movements. The a priori argument to the contrary, that race is the most important factor in world events, Mises regarded as sheer dilettantism. I completely agree with Mises here, 1,000%. So I don't know how about you all feel about that.
I would say that race plays a very important role in the development of culture in the long run, but in the short run, culture and time preference and IQ have a much greater influence on ideology, which is what actually matters in this scenario which he's talking about. Ideology and human action have actual consequences on both race and the environment at a much faster pace than race has an influence on culture. So I would largely agree, but not entirely. I do think that race plays an important role in the development of culture in the long run.
And you can see this in Yugoslavia. It was one nation. Well, I guess you wouldn't necessarily say nation is the same as the state in this case.
No, I was thinking he was referring to it as being separate from the state entirely.
Yeah.
That's how I use the word, at least. And I mean, it's hard to say because people use them interchangeably in writing without being clear. But just I would say the definition of just a people who have a shared culture and history and language. Right.
So, but he says defined in terms of language. So, Yugoslavia, I think they all speak the same Slavonic language. It might be different dialects, but it's still the same language. But if you look today, throughout basically since the 30s, when Yugoslavia was created, there's internal conflicts everywhere, and it has to do with race, it has to do with religion, it has to do with everything that separates these people.
Yeah, the Balkans have always been probably the most racist region on Earth.
Yeah, so I don't really agree that that it has slight significance. It's probably more circumstantial than what you can say generally.
Yeah, you can draw infinite examples of how race has played a role in history. You could go all the way back to the Hunnic invasion of Europe, in which the barbarians of the north and the Romans allied to repel foreign invaders, or you could just go back to World War II in the east, where you have the Chinese coming to a temporary alliance against the foreign invading forces of the Japanese. So you definitely have different degrees of in-group preference, which tend to relate with ethnicity a lot throughout history. And because of that,
they definitely trend.
Yeah, I believe that race and ethnicity have played a great deal in the formation of nations as we know them. But in the short term, as I said, culture, time preference, IQ, etc., they matter a lot more because they affect ideology and human action in the short term.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also if you look at genopolitics, the parents are very much influence what your politics are, even if they don't raise you. And so, since different races typically have different ideologies that they've adhered to in the past 100 to 200 years, race is going to play a factor in politics.
Yep.
So it's not, you can't like disentangle these things, and this is one of the reasons why empiricist sociology, which includes economics, is a non-starter, because you can't like just take one factor and eliminate it completely. You have to look at it through the lens of a priori truths.
Yeah.
Synthetic a priori statements.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I think I agree with the thing so much in the sense that in response to a lot of people, maybe on the alt-right specifically, and I'm not using it as a pejorative, I'm just saying who do view race as the most important factor. I think maybe nation, like I think Mises is like maybe referencing a sort of nationalism here that goes beyond that. But obviously, nations were created by
Right.
a lot of other
The issue with Mises's view of nation is basically because he's a German. Germany is defined by language; it's not defined by anything else. And so that's a nation in terms of language, but there are nations in terms of shared history. There's nations in terms of
in America specifically, it's a multinational country because we have entire different regions that have completely separate nations living, side by side.
The suppression of the South in the military now is going to be causing issues for them. At least it should.
Yeah. I that's why.
Back to medieval Germany, or at least pre-unification Germany, you would have had a much different conception of nation than Mises is using here, I believe.
Well,
right.
even back then, Deutschland referred to the land that people spoke German, and that's why people could speak of the Germans in 500, 600 years ago, even though Germany wasn't unified, because everyone spoke German in that region.
Yeah, but there were still like, in terms of political I guess autonomy as well as like identity, they were still very decentralized, especially in comparison to like France.
Yeah. But this is just the difference between nation and state.
Yeah.
So
all right. I'm gonna continue unless you guys are good.
Yeah, just
I'm good.
Let's go on.
I think we'd spend like an hour on each section roughly, and I'm still on mine. It's like 10 o'clock, so I'm gonna go ahead and try to speed up real here. If that's cool with everyone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even granting that. No, is that right? Yeah, okay. Even granting that certain races have specially favorable qualities does not necessarily mean that these qualities are entirely biological. They can be predominantly environmental or cultural.
Yeah.
Environment alone, however, cannot account for all group differences. If that were true, as the Marxists claim, it would be possible to adjust the environment in a successful effort to equalize all human differences. That's a really important point. I'm going to put a pin there. We'll come back. It is in the context that Mises reminds that there is a degree of correlation between bodily structure and mental traits, as an individual inherent from his parents, and indirectly from his parents' ancestors, not only the specific biological characteristics of his body, but also a constitution of mental powers that circumscribes the potentialities of his mental achievements and his personality. The attempt to change this is at odds with the doctrine of equality under the law.
So I think that when he's writing about this in the early 20th century, it's entirely reasonable to say that some of these qualities might be predominantly environmental or cultural. But as we're seeing, a lot of the very basic traits of races are predominantly hereditary, and even things that you wouldn't consider to be like natural, like personality, ideology, are also done through heredity.
Right,
Yeah.
and and to accept the ulterior would basically validate their claim. That's the important part. I really like the beginning of that. It was like, if you were to say, no, these groups of people aren't different biologically. It's strictly because of their socioeconomic status or because their environment, or they don't have access to the same kind of schools or healthcare, or it's because of this. It's like, so that lends credence to the argument that it's entirely in a, all you have to do is change the environment and you'll get the equal outcomes. And it's like that it's giving credence to that idea that you can simply just manipulate. Once again, you're manipulating nature and biology to achieve an egalitarian outcome. Like, it's not even possible. A lot of this is different biologically, and you're not able to decree it away.
Yeah.
As a cautionary note, he wrote in one of his last books, Theory and History, that there is no justification for one group feeling racial self-conceit. What may be true for past is not necessarily true for future. For this reason, historians should not adopt a racial interpretation of history. Asserting racial superiority can also have pernicious consequences to one's personal ethics, or on one's personal ethics. Innocuous vanity can easily turn to scorn of those who do not belong to the same distinguished group in an attempt to humiliate and to insult them. This kind of behavior has poisoned the relationship between races for ages to come.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with this section, but...
Alright, I think that the European Revolution really did help put whites in a thing above it, but it wasn't necessarily just like whites existed and therefore they were superior. It's something that whites did consciously. For instance, from the 1600s to the 1900s, the top 1/3 intellectually, like in IQ terms, replaced the bottom 2/3 twice in that 300-year span. And so that's really what really helped Europeans.
Yeah, I wouldn't reject a racial interpretation of history, because I think that being white is a part of what defined, of what allowed Europe to come to prominence, even if indirectly. But I agree with the notion that that's not eternal and that can change. And even though we are still white, even if we remained white, that doesn't mean we will always remain prosperous.
Yep. You could easily see that socialism would lead to bio-Leninism, and that would lead to the downfall of the whites.
Yep.
Whatever the results of the studies of racial differences, Mises said, would in no way affect his view that the free society and division of labor are the best way to deal with group differences. Race theory cannot in any way refute the case for liberalism, since race theory and liberal society are quite compatible. It may be assumed that the races do differ in intelligence and willpower, and that, this being so, they are very unequal in their ability to form society, and further the better races further that the better. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm lost myself here. Okay, and further, the better races distinguish themselves precisely by their special aptitude for strengthening social cooperation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think this is something that the quote unquote realists need to understand, is that economic freedom and racial differences aren't incompatible, essentially.
Yeah.
Right, and that they're when it comes to division of labor specifically, you could talk about like, you don't have to be a egalitarian or deny IQ differences. Those can all exist, and it still would make sense to have a free market where people can fill roles that are best adapt for them, and kind of all go into whatever sectors that they're best specialized in, and they have their comparative advantage.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, the studies on race at this point in time, where Mrs. lived, were not as developed as they are today. So, they weren't able to draw conclusions as well as we are. And I would say that there's a lot of people who say that the free market is inherently anti-racist insofar as uh, the only thing that matters is whether people have money or not, whether people have capital to spend. And I don't think that's entirely true because we have clearly observed that ethnocultural uniformity contributes to societal prosperity because uniform society doesn't have trust issues. It has less violence. It has tons of less problems than multicultural societies, and I could give you over 100 studies that show this. So even in a free market, the natural division of labor would probably discriminate racially because those who cooperated with their own race over different races would be able to produce more because they would have less constraints associated with these racial disparities.
And he actually talks about how classical liberalism allows for the cooperation between the races. So I think Bert should actually read that.
Yep.
I didn't. Bert should actually do what?
Read.
Oh,
Read the
I was
rest
going to. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm Finland, dude. All right. It is the free market and the law of comparative advantage that make cooperation between races possible. Classical liberalism argues that the free labor is more productive than unlabor, and that, says Mises, is sufficient reason for favoring liberalism. Liberalism in no way depends on the natural job postulate of the equality or equal rights of all men. It may be admitted that the races differ in talent and character, and that there's no hope of ever seeing those differences solved. So yeah, we kind of talked about this just now. But
just to clarify, classical liberalism argues that free labor is more productive than unfree labor. Just for the chat, because you broke up there. It wasn't mostly related to you, but it was I was just trying to get us back on track to finishing this.
Yeah, no, I know. It's all good. In opposition to the Nazis, Mises writes in 1944 that the Aryan hypothesis was sufficient, let's start over. In opposition to the Nazis, Mises writes in 1944 that Aryan hypothesis was scientifically disproved long ago. The Aryan race is an illusion. It was bound to be, like all theories that posit a pure stock among white people. Hence, Mises condemned the Nazi campaign against the Jews. It was morally wrong as well as scientifically incorrect, since there is no alleged Jewish or Semitic race. It is proved impossible to differentiate the Jewish Germans anthropologically from the non-Jewish ones. Negroes and whites differ in
bodily
features, but it is impossible to tell a Jewish German from a non-Jewish one by any racial characteristic. I don't know if he hit that one quite on the nose.
Yeah, by the way, here, this is just wrong, and maybe it wasn't back then, because like I said, there weren't as many studies, but nowadays there are DNA links that prove Jews are in fact a race, and experts in genetics have basically, I guess, they agree on this unanimously, I think.
So you have to remember that genetics was not found until 1996.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And also that it is also proven by genetics that they have race mixed with whites, and that they no longer really share genetic similarities to the Jews of 2,000, 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, I'm not saying that he's dumb. But I'm just saying that this the times have proved this wrong. Yeah.
Right.
There are modern studies that show this was wrong, and we can't differentiate Jews from non-Jews.
Now we have the modern science in nosology and earology.
Yeah, so that is stuff that's kind of dated in modern view, but it still his point, not in this piece, but just in the prior paragraph, still holds up of the economic liberalism, or just to say the theory of like his like Austrian economics isn't refuted because people can be genetically proven to be different. It doesn't make the case for like
Yeah, it
against.
doesn't change anything. We're just, noting.
I'm saying yeah. So just noting that this is a very dated view, but nonetheless, still.
Yeah. Mises can be forgiven for believing this, essentially.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it wasn't out there. This stuff didn't exist.
He was probably right to believe this at that point in time, since he didn't have a reason to believe otherwise.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, there were race studies that were done at this time, because this is 1944. There were studies done by this time, but it wasn't like an overwhelming majority of them. It was just like, oh, there's these like couple dozen of them. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of trash that the Nazi scientists and Soviet scientists following their Lysenkoism had.
With regard to private discrimination based on preferences for one race or ethnic group or another, Mises thought that such an activity was permissible in nature. In natural, excuse me. But yeah, I got it. But the market would tend to make it costly. An unhampered market society, there is no legal discrimination against anybody. Everyone has the right to obtain the place within the social system in which he can successfully work and make a living. The consumer is free to discriminate, provided that he is ready to pay the cost. This is kind of, I think, at odds with a lot of what Kyle was saying earlier. With the fact that it makes it discrimination is costly and to you.
It depends.
It can be. Like, if you're a business owner and you just refuse to provide your goods and services to a specific ethnic group, you're going to be losing money. But
yeah, in today's society, that couldn't be more the case. That would absolutely be the deal. So he's right. Mises is right in this situation for today's society.
It's not always good or always bad to discriminate, but there are situations in which discrimination is appropriate and even desirable. But not.
For instance, if you had an HOA that would just make sure that only Latinos could buy houses in it, it would probably reduce security costs than if you just allowed everyone to come into it. Also, when he says there is no legal discrimination against anyone, he means that there's no discrimination in the law, not that there is anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah, I was going to mention this. Just because, you have the right to discriminate doesn't mean that the system itself is discriminating.
Yeah. He's not saying there's no legal discrimination. He's saying there's no legal discrimination. Like it's worded. It's not as clear.
It's not as clear because I don't know if he really if there was anti-discrimination like talk really back then.
Right.
When he was writing this.
In a world in which people have grasped the meaning of a market society and therefore advocate a consumerist policy, there is no legal discrimination against Jews. Whoever dislikes the Jews may in such a world avoid patronizing Jewish shopkeepers, doctors, and lawyers. Yeah, so this is one thing in society, or when we don't have a market society, because we have anti-discrimination laws where, just bake the cake, for example.
Yep.
Bigot.
Mises treats the issue of race and ethnicity as an anti-egalitarian scientist who defers to the natural patterns of group interaction, even if these patterns imply systematic discrimination by one group against another. As a justification for such action, he rejected the theoretical grounding of most of the race theorists of his time, but he did not shrink from the conclusion that certain groups might have advantages over other groups in particular areas, and even saw justification in speaking of superior group traits. Thus, he rejected all attempts to equalize groups in an attempt to treat them differently by law. Group differences were best harmonized in a liberal market order.
We're at your section now. Would you like us to read it for you so you can save energy?
I'm good. Sorry I'm not talking to everybody. I'm really tired, but
Would you like, for instance, Kyle to read your section?
Yeah, I can do that if you want.
Sure, if he wants to. I mean, alright, sure, go ahead.
Alright,
Um,
so I'll
do you have
take...
do we have anything with what Boat just said?
Not really.
Okay.
Alright,
So
so now we're getting into section 4, which is multiculturalism. So, Mises was emphatically pro-Western because of the West was responsible for the ideas of freedom, stretching all the way back from the Greeks to the Romans to Europe and then America. He states that the Greeks were the first to grasp the meaning and significance of institutions warranting liberty, and that despite the oligarchs, the main tenor of Greek ideology was the pursuit of liberty. The ideas of liberty led to the ideas of representative government, habeas corpus, separation of church and state, judicial examination, and freedom of speech, and transformed the subjects of tyranny to free citizens, according to Mises. Any comment?
um, not really.
Alright. This contrasts with the East, which Mises says hasn't produced any literature comparable with the modern West since the ancient times. The problems that agitated the West and spurred them to develop these ideas never occurred in the East. The West thought the power of despots should be questioned and that the individual should separate from the state and create a framework in which it is necessary to protect private citizens' wealth from confiscation by tyrants. In the East, no one's wealth was protected except the rulers. Thus, no large-scale capital accumulation was possible. No middle class developed, and thus there was no public to patronize artists or investors. Mises goes on to say that the children of the East know nothing else than to follow the routine of their environment, advancement by the state. The alert youth of the West see the world as a field of action in which he can earn fame, eminence, honors, and wealth. So I believe this is directly from the anti-capitalistic mentality, right? So we have already talked about this.
Yeah, the very last bit of my section is the last bit of the anti-capitalist mentality that I already did.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
specifically remember this, him talking about the East and how they didn't develop capitalism. That's why they stagnated, so I agree with it entirely. I don't really have anything to add here.
Stressing about the notes on this one because it was literally just what I had done like a week ago.
Alright,
Yeah.
so I will just go on. The idea of liberty was made possible by the wealth of the West. Other civilizations reject... Sorry, I think this part is... the idea of liberty was what made possible the wealth of the West. Other civilizations reject Western ideas while wanting its material benefits. He states that non-Caucasians may hate the white man and want to plot his destruction while extravagantly praising their own civilizations, yet yearn for the technological achievements of the West. Whatever people may say about the West, all peoples look upon it with envy as its achievements want to reproduce them and admit to its superiority. And yeah, that's absolutely true. That's a great point here. Everybody talks about how the whites are the most evil race in the world and how they exploited the entire world. But we were a lot more prosperous than the rest of the world long before that, and that's specifically what allowed us to go and travel the entire world and establish colonies and establish new nations and etc. So this notion that the whites are only prosperous because they were exploiters is blatantly false, and obviously there's also the fact that basically every nation and every racial group has exploited another at some point in history. That's just how civilization was and still is to a considerable degree. So does anyone have anything to add to that?
No. Yeah, we already kind of discussed this last week. So.
Yep. So now the next section is gonna talk about the literature and arts. No, wait, I skipped a little part here. So Mises goes on to say that in the West, communism would not be heard, so they had to disguise it as super-liberalism, and were free to speak and write about their beliefs. However, in the East, authority does not allow dissent. Mises believed that the West's superiority wasn't permanent, and if the science of the builders of the white man's civilization gave up their rights to omnipotent government, then it would decline. So he's saying that even though freedom is what allowed the West to prevail and to be prosperous, he's saying that this is not permanent, and that if we surrender that freedom for omnipotent government in exchange for this false promise of equality, that prominence is going to go away and our civilization is going to be destroyed. And that's exactly what we're seeing today, more than ever. So
Yeah, and we can see it now, especially in modern times. I don't know how bad it was back then, but in modern times, this behavior is out of control
yep.
in terms of like wanting that to happen, and then people, bending the knee to that.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
yeah,
really
absolutely.
need to physically remove the neocons.
Not just the neocons, we're going to need to physically remove a lot of people. What Emo just said reminded me, I made a post on Twitter, made a tweet a while ago, talking about the origins of transsexuality, which is something that we talked about a little bit ago in Weimar, Germany. And I remember that I said that LGBT was largely being used as a tool against traditionalism and thus against Western civilization. And I had like dozens upon dozens of replies and quotes by Marxists and members of the LGBT community who were just straight up admitting that destroying Western civilization is a good thing, and just mask off. Like, these people are evil. They want to destroy everything that we care about, and any idea of allying with them or even tolerating them is just a grave mistake. But yeah, that's enough of that. Let's just go on.
The reason why I said to physically remove neocons is because it would solidify the right against without the supporters of it.
Yeah.
Because only with the reemergence of the right can you truly defeat the left.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this cool guy on Twitter you guys should follow called actually Neocon Remover.
Oh yeah, great account.
Yep.
All right.
It was also slightly in reference.
Wait, what'd you say, Emo?
Oh, I endorse that.
Oh, alright. So now he's going to go on to talk about the literature and arts, which is also something we covered in the anti-capitalistic mentality, so we're going to be brief about it. In regards to literature and arts, Mises disapproves of much of what the market rewards, but it doesn't affect his opinions of the free market. He claims it's a ransom one must pay. Great literature likely won't be successful in the marketplace, but what is important is that dissent and innovation is allowed to be published. The book Tycoon caters to the public which doesn't always prefer bad books to good books. Buyers lack the discrimination and end up reading books, however it's true, Most literature published today is trash. It's because of the amount produced that the public, as well as the intelligentsia, are able to influence what is written. It's not the fault of the common man that he doesn't read uncommon books. The book market is flooded with trash, but that doesn't stop great authors from making imperishable books. Even if 1,000 books in our age were equal, even if 1 in 1,000 books in our age were equal to one of the past, our age may still be called an age of flowering with literature. Mises believed bad authors and ideas should be publicly shunned and criticized rather than state action taken against them. Everyone is free to read and abstain from reading anything that they choose. Mises did so with detective stories, as discussed on the last streams, and the next part was discussed architecture in the same as the previous episode. So this section of the article basically talks about what we went over in the last few episodes of the anti-capitalistic mentality. So just because there is a lot more literature, because there is a lot more architecture, because there is a lot more art in general, of course that doesn't mean there will be a lot more trash. But that's not an argument against the free market. It's just something that we have to put up with in order to ensure that the to-be geniuses have the freedom they need to make their art, make their literature.
And a society without a cathedral perpetuating a homogeneous worldview, the types of literature without rises to the top would be radically different than that of today.
Yeah.
I mean, go to like Barnes and Noble and like what some of those popular books are. They're dog shit. But that's because they're being read by people who already have a predetermined view of what their outlook should be.
Yep.
Yeah, imagine what the New York Times bestsellers would be if the cathedral wasn't,
Well, there wouldn't be a New York Times.
Yeah.
That too.
But I get your point, obviously.
Okay,
Right.
so now I think I'm just gonna read the summary like straight from the article since it's really short. So I'll just read it straight from the article since we didn't really put that in the notes, but it's really short. So, all right. So here's the summary. This is straight from the article. In sum, we see that Ludwig von Mises held many cultural positions central to modern American traditionalist conservatism, all of which are centered on his anti-egalitarianism. He favored traditional families organized on the principle of patriarchy and viewed the accompanying obligation of fidelity as binding. He thought that such institutions as the family and marital fidelity were natural, exclusively civilized, and highly desirable. He thought it was possible to make generalizations about race and ethnic groups when they exhibit distinctive traits, to study these differences, and even to use racial and ethnic generalizations as principles of action, while opposing any legal discrimination among groups. He praised Western civilization as superior to all others because it is the fount of liberty and capitalism. He criticized mass culture and counterculturalism while favoring Western literature and arts that had stood the test of time. So that's the summary paragraph from the article, which basically summarizes what we went over in the past 2.5 hours.
Yeah. Great summary.
Yep, great summary.
And I think it's worth noting here at the end that this work or these views of Mises aren't what are obviously shared most about him. Clearly, it's his economics. But it's funny to me that he has very similar. I mean, they have definitely disagreements. He has very similar cultural views to Hoppe, but what he's known for are his economic writings, and a lot of what Hoppe gets criticism for in mainstream libertarianism is his like views on culture. But when you look at what Mises thought about culture, he's way more, I think, conservative, or just to say traditional. Let's just use that word. Than people think of it as, because I guess they just view him as a quote unquote classical liberal. So they associate him with liberalism in a general term, and then they kind of have a modern interpretation of that word. So they think about him being more classically liberal than Hoppe being like a very culturally conservative person who like is like, but they agree on economics. And it's like, I would say they probably agree on, 90% of cultural stuff, or maybe even more in anyway. Like if you look at a lot of stuff Mises is talking about here with everything we went over.
Yeah,
right,
and I believe the same goes for Rothbard.
Oh yeah, too. Well, he's the link between them, of course.
So
Yeah,
Hoppe has talked about this, where his argumentation ethics, his ideas about secession, his ideas about covenant communities. These are all things he developed, first developed in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, and he's basically been working on them ever since. And these were based on lectures he gave at UNLV with Rothbard. And Rothbard would often be in the lecture listening to Hoppe, and afterwards he would say, "Very good, Hoppe. You said something I agree with."
Yeah.
And so it's not so much that Hoppe is uncucking libertarianism or anything like that. It's more the fact that Hoppe is just more explicit that he's not a cucked left libertarian.
Right. Yeah, he emphasizes it more, and it becomes a lot more of like I don't want to say more of a central thing, but it's not in the background as much.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of liberty.
Yeah, I think this is because Rothbard had already developed the economics side of it, and so it had Mises and Kolomengo and von Bavik. And so what's really left is the social cooperation generally of a libertarian society, not just the economics of it.
Yeah.
I think a good justification for people that don't know, I guess, how the family even came to be and why these institutions should be protected, should read Hans Hermann Hoppe's A Short History of Man, and the first chapter on page 21 on the origin of private property in the family. He goes through how humans developed, the nuclear family, or even the extended family, and then how it became, the nuclear family.
Yeah.
And the economics of, how that occurred over thousands of years.
Yep.
Yeah. I have an excerpt here that I saved that I think it's very, very good and very relevant. So I'll just read it. It's fairly short. Alright. So Mises can be seen as a typical of 20th century laissez-faire economics, as the advocates of free markets have largely been associated with cultural traditionalism. Conversely, the advocates of socialism have been associated with cultural libertinism. Libertarians who regard themselves as neither left nor right, and who therefore mix free markets with libertinism, dismiss this pattern as an accident or as a result of Christian conservatives intent on promoting their religious agenda. But if there is coherence to Mises' position, it may assist in the development of a deeper understanding of the relation between a free economic order and a traditionalist perspective on cultural matters. In Mises, the connection between laissez-faire and traditionalism can be seen in two ways. First, Mises and most other economic libertarians are vehemently anti-egalitarian, as shown above. And most cultural leftists support some sort of social and cultural leveling. Second, Mises and other economic libertarians regard the free market and traditional social institutions as in keeping with the natural order, whereas socialism and interventionism, as well as cultural libertinism, seek to upset this natural order and to impose designs on society that are alien to the social patterns of freedom. So this is basically what we've been talking about, and also specifically, especially what Bert mentioned, that, you know, leftism is a fight against the natural order.
Right, and I think we need to go into the summary and section 7, which is some points of analysis. So, in sum, we see that Ludwig von Mises held many cultural positions central to modern American
I already
tradition.
read that part.
Oh, you already have?
Yeah, I read that part. So we just need to do section 7 now.
Okay, Okay, I must have missed that because I was looking at the notes and it was just like, oh wait, we didn't... Anyways.
Yeah, no, I already read the summary, and this thing that I just read now is also from section 7, so we just need to go over the last few points here.
Yep, so...
So he also talks here in the some points of analysis that basically what we already said, that the cultural thought of Mises is received virtually no attention, and most people only pay attention to his economics, which is probably a mistake. So he reinstates here that Mises speaks out against free love and promiscuity, and yeah, he classifies Mises as a value-free scientist, a rationalist, and a utilitarian, which I think is fair.
Yeah, he also, at the end, he also set capitalism and Christianity against each other in terms of their respective historical contributions. This does not mean he's hostile to religion, but it's... The problem with the Christian church in the past couple hundred years is its anti-capitalism. The churches of all denominations, Mises complained, are promoting economic fallacies instead of teaching Christian doctrine. And yeah, that is really annoying, to basically see Christians basically ignore economics and just make pronouncements on what economies should be like.
Yeah. No comment here.
Yeah. Also, it's also interesting that in section 2, he talks about subverting social institutions and that it's a product of subverting social institutions that are products of the unalterable fact of nature is highly dangerous. And I can just see that. You can see that in the conservative movement after Mises has died. The neocons coming in and taking over. Then in libertarianism, Mises and Rothbard being basically pushed to the aside and only being essentially quote mined to influence the the egalitarian ethic.
Yeah, they make great use of their economic contributions and disregarded their views on culture, and then they just used like their image to help build up the libertarian movement, but completely disregarded a lot of the things that it was based on.
Yeah, like I feel like if you isolated any of like his cultural quotes like directly from him, from the context of them being quotes from Mises, and asked like Cato types about them, I mean, they would be, I feel like they'd be freaking out about them, but they would then also tell you that they really loved Mises's work or something.
Yeah.
I've almost never heard a Cato person like reference Mises or even praxeology or anything. I don't pay that much attention to them, but you don't even hear it in passing.
Oh, I wouldn't. No, they don't. I'm just saying. I think they would, in name, say like, yeah, that's we're okay with that stuff. It's just the Rothbard, and the Hoppe stuff they were problem with, but we're cool with Mises. And if you read them some of these Mises quotes, they would totally not be cool with them.
Yeah,
because they're culturally egalitarians.
It's a very, very interesting note who you reference a lot, because the Cato guys will reference Hayek way more than they will reference Mises.
And there's nothing you can get in Hayek that's not in Mises anyway. So.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, Hayek has like 2 books that are really good, and the rest of them are trash.
Basically, The Road to Serfdom is great.
Actually, I wouldn't even consider The Road to Serfdom to be really a the great book that one of the great books that Hayek has written, because you can get
Would you
that.
say The Fatal Conceit?
Actually, no, it's actually 2 economics textbooks.
Oh.
He wrote. I forget the names of it right now, but it's when Hayek is talking about purely economics back in the 1930s, in the early 1940s, he's amazing. But after that, it's just kind of either it's trash, or you can get better things from someone else.
So the last thing that I want to mention, that I want to bring up, is points 7 and 8 here. Sorry, just point 7. 8 is not really that important, but so it's not really now talking about Mises, but it's more elaborating on the topics that we discussed. So Mises leaves open the question of why it might be in the interests of women in traditional roles to oppose women's suffrage. So this is going back to the gender role thing. So logical speculation produces the following possible deduction. Feminists are the ones most likely to exercise the vote once it is granted. Given their socialist intellectual framework, feminists would also support heightened state intervention, which is likely to make the lives of women who are in full-time wives and mothers more difficult, with state childcare, fewer tax breaks for motherhood, and cultural opposition to the family. Greater state intervention by making most people poorer also makes the maintenance of the traditional family with one wage earner more difficult. Moreover, non-feminist wives and mothers would have less interest in being politically active. Thus, by default, women's suffrage leads to political power being exercised against non-feminists. It would be far better, Mises might have argued, for the non-feminists to oppose women's suffrage than to live under the feminist domination that would logically follow the passage of women's suffrage. And this could not be further from the truth, because if you just go and look at the 2016 election results, and if you were to only consider female votes, the Democrats would have won by like 100%, I think, like 100% of the states, and that's
Right,
just
but isn't that what he's saying?
Yeah. I'm just. No, sorry.
I think you said.
I used the wrong I used the wrong word. I meant that this couldn't be closer from the truth.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, now that women can vote, they do vote almost like in massively disproportionately towards the left.
Oh yeah, 100%.
I also really like point 5 here, where he says welfarism is a halfway house to socialism, and I just love that because
That's so good.
it's so good. But also, libertarians tend to ignore welfarism to talk about warfarism, and so it's just like, yeah, no, welfarism is probably more socialist than a welfare state. It's just that the violence that the welfare state brings about is just morally wrong.
Yeah, it's also like the seen versus the unseen thing, where you can see the war, but the damage the welfare state causes, you just don't see the prosperity that never happened and the families that never get created.
Yep.
So yeah, and that's the seen versus the unseen, which the Austrian School of Economics actually tries to elucidate through its synthetic a priori logical deduction.
Then there's a point where Mises down here where Mises posts cringe at point 4, but in the second set of points under notes.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
If you go to the notes section, at point 4.
Yeah.
Oh, Mises advocated democracy.
Cringe, bro.
Oh yeah, yeah. Cringe.
Yeah. Also, Mises' rule-based utilitarianism is cringe.
Yes. But him opposing women's suffrage is based, so I guess it makes up for it.
Yeah, I think I said yesterday, Mises is about as based as a classical liberal can get.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, if you just took all those things about here's why women, if you went on Twitter right now and you said, here's why libertarians should oppose women being able to vote, and you just listed specifically the reasons Mises lists, people would be like, I'm all for libertarianism, but this just sounds straight up fascist or some, however they use the term. And you could just be like, oh, this is just out of Mises. Like, their heads would explode. I actually might test that theory later.
Yeah, we need to as we go through socialism.
Like fakeitarians would be like, you're not a real libertarian. Like, they would screenshot your thing. Like, this isn't, how is this libertarian? And it's just like, wow, bro, Mises.
Not again.
That'll only happen if emo retweets what we are tweeting about. Because fakeitarians avoid me. Like, unless I reply directly to them, they avoid me.
They have also been avoiding me.
Yes.
I have no idea. I have no idea if there's anything on their Facebook because I deactivated my Facebook, so I haven't been able to look.
Damn it. Hello, though. Say hello to Brazil. Actually, say hi to Brazil, and Brazil actually has a bunch of libertarians in it.
We do.
Yeah.
We do. Because everybody hates the government.
Yeah, it's so funny. You can find so many Austrian books that are like
In Portuguese.
was it Portuguese? Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of libertarians here, especially ANCAPs.
Yeah.
I think I'm inclined to say that most of them are still on the more lawbird side, but
It's a start.
yeah, it's a
Well,
start. It's
it's-
better than being a communist. Better.
Oh, it's really weird because, and I don't live there obviously, but a lot of times on Twitter I'll stumble across a profile that has a Hans Hermann Hoppe picture, and like it's like 50% of the time I'll be like, I don't know who this is, and I'll click on it, and it'll be someone in Brazil.
Yeah, we do have a fair amount of Hoppeans. I'm not sure
I
a lot
do.
of them subscribe to his whole worldview, but he is, I guess, well known. You can get Democracy, the God That Failed for really cheap here, translated. The only reason I don't have it is because I want a version in English. I don't really like reading in Portuguese. So
Yeah,
I kind of want to get the original one, but you can get it for like really cheap here, and it looks it's by the Mises Institute Brazil, and it looks a lot better than the original version. It has a really fancy cover.
Yeah, actually, it'd be probably a good idea once we get more popular to start accepting articles in Portuguese. I was about to say Brazilian, but it's actually Portuguese.
Yeah, if you said that, I would hit you. If you said Spanish, I would redacted you.
Yep.
And then one thing worth noting it's like the first note is Mises repudiated the term conservatism, and I think and this is like the same thing with liberal, how the word liberal means nothing. By today's standards,
They were making arguments, and it would become a better argument if they were able to lean on Christian doctrine, like in addition to their economic analysis.
you can go to Lviv or wherever the hell he's buried and just become Orthodox on a card and put it on his grave.
Oh man, sadly there isn't. How should I put this? There isn't posthumous conversions.
Yeah. No, But it is just funny to. This is maybe a part of a. This might be what I'm about to say might be kind of a straw man, but you do see a lot of Republicans kind of counter signal libertarianism sometimes. And it's like just reading Mises's cultural views. It's like he has a lot more balls to say all this shit than a lot of you motherfuckers who wouldn't say half of this shit publicly. And he was saying it like,
Yeah, this is actually what kind of pisses me off about some of the right-wing libertarians, especially cough cough Tom Woods.
Yep.
Because it's clear and obvious that he is a trad cat, but he's not going to ever talk about all of the bullshit leftism in terms of culture that's going on in libertarianism because he wants to be quote unquote ecumenical. The thing with ecumenism is it's a heresy when you're trying to be ecumenical to heretics. It is just part of being part of the Catholic Church to be ecumenical to people who are correct believing.
Well, I mean, I know exactly what you're referring to. I have to jump in my Tom Woods defense. And I know you like him as well. I'm just saying. I don't think he gives them. I don't think he tries to. I know he's just being ecumenical. I think he expresses his views personally well enough. I just don't think he wants. I think he's optics checking. Let's just say.
Well, it's not just that, but he'll have left libertarians, and he'll do a bunch of. He'll basically ally himself with left libertarians, even if he doesn't explicitly say, "Yeah, I'm going to ally with agorists or bleeding heart libertarians." He will work with them, and he'll work with them and his major contributions in the last year have mostly been with left libertarians, not with right libertarians.
Yeah.
And that's the really odd bit. I mean, the big thing he did with right libertarians is Mises U, but I mean, that's like one day he was there.
Yeah.
So, and even then, Mises U is not necessarily supposed to be a right libertarian training ground. It's supposed to be an Austrian economics training ground.
Well, it's. I mean, I know exactly what you're referring to, obviously. But it's so funny because the left libertarians still view him as, literally Hitler. I mean, you look at this entire the Loser Brigade thing. I mean, there's people who their entire brand is Tom Woods derangement syndrome, and thinking he is this insanely terrible, no bad guy. And it's funny because our view of him is mostly that he's kind of not being radical enough.
Yeah. So this is just the left understands physical removal, and the right really needs to understand this, that they can't be ecumenical to the left, just as the left isn't ecumenical to the right. I mean, this is even I'm just talking about ecumenical, and that's obviously church related. Those ecumenists that want the Catholics and the Orthodox to be united, even though we have completely different views on almost everything theologically speaking. And it's just like, well, there can't be union unless there is union of unless everyone's of one mind, as Paul points out in, I think it's Thessalonians. I might be wrong. It might be Galatians. But the whole point of the one holy Catholic apostolic church is that they're all of one mind, and you can't have ecumenicism if there isn't one mind on issues. So the same thing is basically true with social cooperation. And if you want to have a society based on certain foundations, you need to have that society basically of one mind on those issues. And you can't have all of these subversive elements running free.
And this is where is probably our biggest disagreement with Mises, since he defended the right of communists to speak and write and publish freely.
Well, I don't necessarily want the state to come down and do it, but I think that as social movements, we need to influence this and so on and so forth, because that the market is like in a libertarian social order. It's going to be the market that does this, not necessarily the state.
Yeah.
So
But I think that if the state were to do it, I would support it. I don't really think they will ever do it, obviously, because the state is aligned with the left. But
well,
if they were to do it, I would support it.
The state is not necessarily aligned with the left. It is aligned against capitalism and free markets and the protection of private property and the natural law. It's
I.e. the
and
left.
it leads you to be for the left, but you can see throughout history, like even pre-left thinking, it's before Marx essentially. The state was still against capitalism, so it's not necessarily that they love the left, it's more that they hate the things that the right are based on.
Yeah, I agree.
So.
Anyways, I think that's it, right?
Yeah,
We've been
that's
going
it.
for 3 hours already, so...
Yeah, we
Yep.
need to really be cutting back because, yeah, the 2 hour mark is kind of the sweet spot.
Okay, so... Do you have anything to tell us about the website?
Yeah, we are finally putting up a bunch of new articles. So we have one that's currently the featured article about reactionary libertarianism. We have another article that was just published last night that is on my final, well, not my final, but my last response for now to Konkin and his followers. Then soon we're going to have Matt's article come out. I think we're going to have that sometime in the middle of the week. And then I'm also going to be working on my primer for argumentation ethics, and we have more guests that'll be want to write articles for this website.
Alright.
So
That's a lot. So yeah, stay tuned.
Oh, and also just with the Hoppean and generally, we are pushing forward the graphic design upgrade soon, and we are also going to be starting a new podcast. I don't know who exactly is going to be part of it. I'd like to be part of it, but we can't have too many people on it, otherwise we won't get through any topics. So
Yeah. Alright,
What
Hell
is
yeah.
the next book we're doing?
Oh yeah, the next book.
the next book is Socialism.
Socialism.
Socialism and Economic and Sociological Analysis by Mises. It's the first section of this book really apes many concepts from a couple chapters from it, and it's going to be interesting to see Mises not only go after economic socialism, but also the cultural and social agenda of socialism.
Yeah. And is that next week, or are we gonna have a break?
It's going to be next week, and it's going to be interesting because there's many people that don't want to talk about cultural Marxism, but even Mises did back in 1922. What a surprise.
Yeah, so, right, next week. So do you guys want to show?
Yeah, all of our Twitter handles in the top right-hand corner. I am Colton.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Emo.
I'm Bert Grimm. You can follow me at Neocon Remover on Twitter.
Yep, all the handles are in the top right corner, and yeah, that's it. So good night, guys. Have a nice week.
Night, buddy.
Alright, let's read the stats.